The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the iron track had been the sole constant in Clara May Hollis's world for 3 days and 4 nights. It was a sound that had become a part of her, a metallic heartbeat counting down the miles that separated the woman she was from the girl she had been forced to leave behind. Outside the grimy window, the flat, sun-baked plains of Kansas had slowly, grudgingly, given way to rolling hills, then to dense, dark forests of pine and fir that clawed at the sky. The air itself had changed, losing its dusty warmth for a sharp, damp chill that smelled of pine sap and wet earth. This was a different country altogether. Clara sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap over her small, worn reticule. Inside it, nestled beside a few carefully saved coins and a spare needlebook, was the letter. Its paper was soft as old linen from the countless times she had unfolded and refolded it, reading the spidery handwriting until the words were memorized, etched onto her heart as a prayer. Asterisk, Reverend Michael Theron, First Congregation Church of Silver Creek, a position for a seamstress of good character, modest lodging provided. It was a lifeline thrown across 1,000 miles of uncertainty, a promise whispered from a place she'd never seen by a man she'd never met. It was everything. She was a tall woman. It was the first thing people noticed, the thing that had defined and damned her. At nearly 6 feet, she towered over most men and certainly every woman she had ever known back in Lawrence. It wasn't a delicate, willowy height, but a solid, sturdy frame built on farm work and practicality. For years, she had tried to shrink herself, slumping her shoulders, ducking her head, speaking in a softer voice than was natural to her. It had done no good. Her height was a declaration she couldn't silence. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the few other passengers in the carriage. A family with 3 boisterous children had disembarked yesterday, their laughter leaving a hollow echo. A pair of slick-haired salesmen in city suits had gotten off at the last major depot, their voices dripping with condescension for the backwoods territory they were entering. Now, only a few grizzled prospectors and a tired-looking woman with a baby remained. No one paid Clara any mind, and for that, she was grateful. Anonymity was a luxury she had rarely been afforded. The train's whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that seemed to tear through the thick mountain air. The brakes hissed and groaned, and the relentless clatter of the wheels slowed, each turn a laborious effort. Silver Creek. She pressed her face closer to the glass, her breath misting the cool pain. The town, if one could call it that, was less built than carved from the wilderness. It was a raw, gaping wound in the side of the forest. A single, wide street, more mud than dirt, ran through its center, flanked by buildings of rough-hewn lumber, their facades unpainted and already weathering to a dull gray. A massive sawmill dominated one end of the town, its great circular blade silent for the moment, though heaps of sawdust rose like pale hills around it. The entire place seemed to crouch under the shadow of the surrounding mountains, which were so vast and close they felt like prison walls. There was no softness here, no gentle slope or welcoming meadow. There was only mud, wood, and stone. A knot of apprehension tightened in Clara's stomach. This was so much rougher, so much more isolated than she had imagined. The Reverend's letter had spoken of a pious, hard-working community. Looking at the saloon with its swinging doors and the hard-faced men already loitering on the boardwalk, Clara wondered if she and the Reverend shared the same definition of piety. With a final, jarring lurch, the train shuddered to a halt. The conductor, a man with a walrus mustache and weary eyes, strode through the car, bellowing, "Silver Creek, end of the line. All ashore, that's going ashore." Clara took a slow, steadying breath. This was it. There was no turning back. The money she'd spent on the ticket was nearly all she had. Her family had made it clear she was no longer welcome, her departure more of a relief to them than a sorrow. They were good people, her parents, but they were simple people. and they did not know what to do with a daughter who was too tall, too quiet, and too stubbornly independent for any of the local boys, especially after Elias. The memory was a familiar sting, a wound that refused to scar over. Elias Pritchard, with his charming smile and promises that felt as solid as the Kansas earth. He hadn't minded her height. He'd said he'd found her composure graceful, her skill with a needle a marvel. For 6 blissful months, she had allowed herself to believe him. She had ignored the whispers of the other girls, the pitying looks from the town matrons. She had poured all her hopes into the wedding quilt she was piecing, each tiny, perfect stitch a testament to a future she thought was finally hers. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. His father, a man of considerable influence, had declared the match unsuitable. A man needs a wife he can stand beside, not hide behind. He'd roared in the middle of the general store for all to hear. My boy will not be married to a giantess who thinks she knows better than her husband. Elias, weak-willed and eager to please his father, had not defended her. He had simply stopped calling, returning her letters unopened. The humiliation had been absolute, a public stripping of her worth. It wasn't just the broken promise, it was the reason for it. She was too much, too tall, too self-possessed, an oddity, an object of ridicule. That was when she had left. She packed one valise with her 2 good dresses, her sewing kit, and the wedding quilt she couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bear to leave behind. She had written to a distant aunt, who had mentioned a Reverend Theron in a letter years ago, a man who had served in her parish before moving west. The reply, when it came, felt like a miracle. Clutching the handle of her worn leather valise, Clara stood. She smoothed the front of her gray wool traveling dress, a garment of her own, making simple, practical, and durable. It was immaculate, despite the long journey. Her appearance was all she had to recommend her. She adjusted her bonnet, securing it firmly over the dark brown hair she kept ruthlessly coiled in a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Then, with a straight spine and a carefully composed face that betrayed none of the turmoil within, she walked to the end of the car. The step down to the platform was steep. As her boots hit the splintered wood, the air hit her with force. It was thin and cold, and carried the overwhelming scent of pine and sawdust, so strong it was almost bitter. The silence was unnerving. For a moment, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, its collective gaze fixed on the tall woman who had just appeared in its midst. She stood there, a solitary figure on the empty platform. The train hissed behind her, a great iron beast impatient to begin its journey back to civilization. She scanned the faces of the handful of people who had gathered to watch the train's arrival. A few rough-looking lumberjacks, their flannel shirts stained with sweat and pitch. A woman with a tired face peering from the doorway of the general store. A blacksmith, his leather apron black with soot, paused with his hammer in mid-air. None of them smiled. None of them stepped forward. There was no kindly, white-haired reverend waiting with a welcoming hand. There was no one. The staring was a physical thing. She felt it like a pressure against her skin. It wasn't the curious, quickly averted glance of strangers in a city. This was a hard, assessing, and deeply suspicious scrutiny. Their eyes traveled from the tip of her sensible boots up the long line of her frame to the top of her bonnet, lingering on her height. She could see the word forming on their lips. In their minds, asterisk, strange asterisk. She was an outsider, a foreign object dropped into their closed world, and they were trying to decide if she was a threat, a fool, or a joke. A slow flush crept up her neck, a hot tide of the old, familiar shame. She fought it down, forcing her chin up. She would not slump. She would not cower. She had come here to be useful, to earn her keep and build a life where her worth was measured by the skill in her hands, not the inches of her stature. Her hands, gloved in worn cotton, tightened on the handle of her valise. They were her best feature. She'd always thought long-fingered and strong, but nimble. The tips of her fingers were calloused, pebbled with the pinpricks of 1,000 hurried stitches, proof of her trade. They were hands that could turn a bolt of plain calico into a respectable dress, mend a torn work shirt so the seam was nearly invisible, and craft quilts so fine they were works of art. These hands were her truth. Let them stare at her height. It was her hands that would save her. The train's whistle blew again, a final, deafening blast. With a great chuff of steam and a groan of metal, it began to pull away, leaving her in a sudden, profound silence, broken only by the distant whine of the sawmill finally starting up. She was alone, truly and utterly alone on a splintered platform in a town that looked like the edge of the world, with nothing but a hopeful letter and the stubborn set of her own jaw. For a terrifying second, her resolve wavered. The urge to run after the disappearing train, to beg them to take her back to a world she understood, was a physical ache in her chest. But where would she go back to Kansas? To be a spinster aunt living on the charity of her siblings? A constant, towering reminder of her own failure? No. She had made her choice. She drew in a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air, held it until her lungs burned, and let it out slowly. The air of Silver Creek, the air of her new life, one foot in front of the other. She told herself, that's all it takes. She took the first step off the platform and onto the muddy street. The mud of Silver Creek's main street was a greedy, living thing. It sucked at the soles of Clara's boots with each hesitant step, threatening to pull her down into its thick, brown embrace. The boardwalks on either side of the street were intermittent, ending abruptly to leave treacherous crossings where wagons had churned the earth into a deep, impassable mire. To stay clean was impossible. To maintain one's dignity was a battle. Clara stood frozen in the middle of it all, her valise a dead weight in her hand. The stares of the townspeople had not lessened. They were a physical force, pressing in on her, making the air feel thin and sharp. She felt like a great awkward heron that had mistakenly landed in a barnyard full of suspicious chickens. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to find refuge in the empty train station. But it was already behind her, offering no sanctuary. She needed to find the church, but the identical grim-faced wooden buildings gave no clue as to which one might house a man of God. Her carefully constructed wall of composure was beginning to crack, fine fissures of panic spreading through her. She was lost, conspicuous, and utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable. It was then that a shadow detached itself from the deeper shade of the livery stable. A man. He moved with an unhurried, deliberate gait, his long legs eating up the ground. The first thing she registered, with a familiar, sinking feeling, was his height. He was as tall as she was, perhaps even an inch or two taller. But on him, the height was different. It was a source of power, an anchor that held him to the earth, not an awkward accident of birth. His shoulders were wide enough to block out the light, strained against the seams of a worn flannel shirt under a heavy duster made of dark, oiled horsehide. The coat was a practical garment, scarred and stained by weather and work, falling to his knees over mud-caked trousers tucked into scuffed leather boots. A low-crowned hat, its brim stained with sweat and dust, was pulled down, shadowing his face. Clara's hand tightened on her valise. She braced herself. She knew this type of man, or thought she did. She had seen them in Kansas, men full of swagger and cheap whiskey, whose eyes roamed over a woman with brazen ownership. A crude joke was coming, or a mocking comment about the weather. Up there, it was as certain as the sunrise. He stopped a few feet away, a respectful distance that surprised her. He didn't crowd her, didn't try to intimidate. He simply stood there, waiting for her to acknowledge him. When he finally spoke, his voice was nothing like the boisterous boom she had expected. It was a low, calm baritone, a voice that seemed to absorb the noise of the world rather than add to it. "Ma'am," he said, the word a simple statement of fact. "You looking for someone?" Clara's defenses, already on high alert, snapped into place. Years of warding off unwanted attention had taught her to be curt, to give no opening. But she was lost, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She lifted her chin to meet his gaze, prepared for the leering amusement, or, worse, the pity she always saw in a man's eyes. And then she saw them. His eyes. They were the color of dark, wet slate, set in a face tanned to the color of old leather by sun and wind. There were fine lines at the corners, etched there by years of squinting into a harsh sun. But it was the expression in them that made her breath catch in her throat. There was no pity. There was no mockery. There wasn't even the flicker of surprise that most people failed to hide when they first looked up at her. His gaze was direct, level, and utterly calm. He looked at her as if a woman of her stature was the most natural thing in the world. He saw her height, acknowledged it as a simple fact, and then looked past it, into her face, waiting for an answer. It was a look of such profound, unassuming respect that it disarmed her more completely than any threat could have. I am, she stammered, hating the weakness in her voice. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the words out. I am looking for the First Congregation Church, for Reverend Theron. The man nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from her face to the muddy street and back again. Church is at the far end of town. Bit of a walk. The Reverend didn't know you were coming. A flush of her earlier humiliation returned. He did. His letter said he would meet the train. The words sounded childish, plaintive, and she regretted them as soon as they were spoken. The man considered this, his expression unreadable. Reverend's a good man, he said, his tone even, but his head is full of scripture. He likely forgot the day. Happens. He wasn't making an excuse for the Reverend so much as stating a fact. Then his slate-gray eyes met hers again. No one to meet you, then? No, she said, the word clipped. He gestured with his chin toward a sturdy buckboard wagon parked near the livery. Its bed empty, save for a few canvas sacks. Two strong-looking draft horses stood patiently in their harnesses. My wagon's just here. I'm heading out that way. I can give you a ride. Clara hesitated. Every lesson her mother had ever taught her about propriety screamed in her mind. To accept a ride from an unknown man in a town of strangers was reckless, foolish. But the alternative was to wade through this street, a spectacle for the entire town, her boots and the hem of her dress ruined. To arrive on the Reverend's doorstep, looking like a half-drowned stray. She looked again at the man's face, at the quiet steadiness in his eyes. There was no guile there, no hidden motive she could discern. It was a simple, practical offer, made by a practical man. She made her decision. Thank you, sir, she said, her voice firm now. I would be most grateful. He gave a short, single nod, as if her acceptance was the only logical outcome. Calder Boone, he said, by way of introduction. He stepped forward and took her valise from her hand before she could protest. The bag, which had felt so heavy to her, seemed to weigh nothing in his grip. He led her to the wagon and, with a brief touch to her elbow that was both courteous and impersonal, helped her up onto the high wooden seat. As he moved around to the driver's side, the loiterers on the boardwalk, who had been watching the entire exchange with avid interest, seemed to deflate. Their entertainment had been cut short. The strange, tall woman was not going to be a source of sport after all. She was being looked after. Calder Boone swung up into his seat with an easy, athletic grace. He took the reins in his large, capable hands, and with a soft cluck of his tongue, set the horses in motion. The wagon lurched, the wheels making a thick, sucking sound as they pulled free of the mud. They moved slowly down the street, and for the first time since her arrival, Clara felt the pressure of the town's gaze lift. In the quiet solidity of this man's presence, she had become invisible. The ride was not filled with the nervous chatter she would have expected. The silence that settled between them was comfortable, woven from the creak of the wagon and the soft plod of the horses' hooves. He didn't ask her where she was from, or what business a woman like her had in a rough place like Silver Creek. His questions, when they came, were simple and rooted in the world around them. "That's the sawmill," he said, nodding toward the whining blade that was now slicing through a massive log. Sawdust spraying like pale gold snow. "Keeps the town fed and the men in whiskey." "I've never seen trees so tall," Clara remarked, looking up at the dark, spear-tipped pines that crowded the edge of town. "They have to be," he replied, his eyes on the road. "Don't get much sun down in these valleys. They grow straight up, reaching for it." The simple observation resonated deep within her. Reaching for the sun. She felt a kinship with the trees. After another moment of quiet, he asked, "You a seamstress, ma'am?" She turned to him in surprise. "Yes, how did you know?" He gave a brief, almost imperceptible glance at her hands, which were resting in her lap. "Your fingers," he said. "The tips got the marks of the needle. My mother had hands like that." It was the most personal thing he had said, and it was a compliment of the highest order. He wasn't praising her face or her form. He was acknowledging her skill, her work, her worth. "You have a ranch, you said," she asked, wanting to deflect the unexpected warmth she felt. "A place for horses," he confirmed. "Boone's Corral. Just outside of town. I gentle 'em. Take the wildness out. Make 'em steady for folks who need a dependable mount." She understood. He was a man who valued steadiness, who cultivated calm. It explained the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him. The wagon rolled past the last of the saloons and onto a slightly better-kept road that led toward a small, whitewashed church. Its simple steeple pointed a clean, white finger toward the gray sky. Beside it stood a tidy parsonage with a small porch and smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was a pocket of peace on the edge of the wilderness. Calder pulled the team to a halt. "Here you are, ma'am. Reverend Theron's—" He was down from the wagon before she could move, rounding the horses to help her. He placed her valise on the dry boards of the porch, then stepped back. His duty was done. "I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Boone," she said, looking directly into his face now. The shadow of his hat couldn't hide the fundamental decency she saw there. He just touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "No thanks needed, just a neighborly thing to do." He turned without another word, his long, easy stride carrying him back to his wagon. He didn't look back. Clara stood on the porch, watching until the buckboard had disappeared back toward the main street. The encounter had lasted no more than 15 minutes, but in that short time, something inside her had shifted. Calder Boone had not offered her pity or charity. He had offered her something far more valuable, a moment of quiet, unassuming grace. He had looked at her, and for the first time in a very long time, she had felt seen for who she truly was, not a giantess, not an oddity, but simply a woman in need of a ride, with a heart a little lighter and a spine a little straighter. She turned and raised her hand to knock on the Reverend's door. Reverend Michael Theron was a man whose spirit was far more robust than his physical form, small and bird-like, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that held the gentle, distracted kindness of a man more at home in the pages of the Old Testament than in the muddy reality of Silver Creek. He had indeed forgotten her arrival. He met her knock with a look of pure, unadulterated bewilderment, which quickly morphed into flustered apology as he pieced together the woman on his porch and the letter in his desk. The room he showed her was exactly as his letter had promised, modest. It was a small, lean-to space built onto the back of the church, likely intended for storage. It contained a narrow cot, a small cast-iron stove for heat, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single straight-backed chair. A small, high window looked out not onto the town, but onto the dense, silent wall of the pine forest. The air inside was cold and smelled of damp wood and old hymnals. To some, it would have been a cell. To Clara, after days on the train and a lifetime of being under the constant scrutiny of her family, it was a sanctuary. It was hers. "It isn't much, my dear," the Reverend fretted, wringing his hands, "but it is clean and dry. You may take your meals with me in the parsonage. Of course, we will find a space for you to do your work in the parish hall. This is perfect, Reverend, Clara said, her voice full of a sincerity that seemed to soothe him. And if it's all the same to you, I would prefer to work here, in my own space. If I can set up a small table by the window, the light will be quite good. And so, she began to build her new world. She spent the first day turning the small room into a home and a workshop. She unpacked her valise, hanging her 2 dresses on a peg behind the door, from the depths of the bag. She carefully removed the wedding quilt, the one she had stitched for a life that never was. Its vibrant colors and intricate patterns were a stark contrast to the plain wooden walls. For a moment, she considered putting it away, a painful reminder of her past. Instead, with a defiant resolve, she spread it neatly over the narrow cot. It would not be a shroud for her broken heart. It would be a blanket to keep her warm. Her sewing corner was arranged with the precision of a surgeon laying out his instruments. A small, rickety table, procured from the church's storage, was placed under the window. Upon it, she set her pincushion, bristling with steel pins, her thimbles, and her heavy tailor's shears. Spools of thread, black, white, brown, and gray, were lined up like disciplined soldiers. Her needlebook, a gift from her grandmother, lay open, its flannel pages filled with needles of every size. This small corner was the heart of her independence. Here, she was not an awkward, oversized woman. She was a master of her craft. Work came, but not in the way she had hoped. The women of Silver Creek were a hard-bitten, practical lot, their hands as rough as their husbands' and their gazes just as sharp. They approached her with a caution bordering on suspicion. The first to arrive was Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, a woman built as solidly as her husband's anvil. She held out a bundle of children's clothes, a shirt with a torn elbow, trousers with a hole in the knee. "Reverend says you do mending," she stated, her eyes flicking from Clara's face down to her feet and back up again. A silent, thorough appraisal. "I do," Clara replied, taking the clothes. Her fingers expertly assessed the damage. "The patch on the knee will be stronger if I double-stitch it. It will be ready by tomorrow afternoon." Mrs. Gable grunted, a sound that was neither approval nor disapproval. "How much?" Clara named a price, a fair and modest sum. The woman's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She had clearly expected a higher figure. She nodded curtly and left without another word. Others followed. They brought her their family's mending, the practical, endless repairs required by a life of hard labor. They were universally reserved, their conversations clipped and focused solely on the work. They would stand in her doorway, never stepping fully inside, as if her small room might contain a contagion. They spoke in low voices, but their eyes were loud, taking in the quilt on her bed, the tidy arrangement of her tools, and always, her height. Clara met their reserve with a quiet, unwavering professionalism. She spoke only of fabrics and seams, of stitches and costs. Her work was her only argument, and she made sure it was a flawless one. The clothes she returned were not merely patched, they were reinforced, stronger than they had been before. The stitches so neat and small they were nearly invisible. The men were another matter entirely. While the women treated her with wary distance, the men saw her as a novelty, a diversion in their rough, monotonous lives. The loggers from the sawmill, their clothes smelling of pine sap and sweat, would saunter past her door, slowing their steps to peer inside. "Got a tall drink of water in town. Boys, one of them called out to his friends, his laughter coarse." Another, bolder than the rest, stopped in her doorway one afternoon, leaning against the frame with a lazy grin. "A woman your size must get powerful lonely," he drawled. "A man could get lost in all that." Clara did not look up from her sewing. The rhythmic pass of her needle through the thick wool of a work shirt did not falter. "I have enough work to keep me company." "Thank you," she said, her voice as cool and even as river stone, her refusal to engage, Her utter lack of reaction was a more effective deterrent than any angry retort would have been. He grumbled under his breath and eventually moved on. But the feeling of being watched, of being assessed like a piece of livestock, lingered in the air. She existed in this strange limbo for nearly 2 weeks. Caught between the women's suspicion and the men's unwelcome attention, she was earning enough to buy her food and put a few coins aside. But she was profoundly alone, an island in a sea of indifferent or hostile faces. Then, one late afternoon, when the sun was slanting low through the pines and casting long shadows across the churchyard, a familiar figure appeared at her door. It was Calder Boone. He stood just outside, his hat in his hands, not leaning against the door frame like the others, but standing straight, his presence filling the space without invading it. He was holding his dark horsehide duster, the one he'd been wearing the day she arrived. "Ma'am," he said, his voice the same low, calm sound she remembered. "Got a tear in this coat. Caught it on a nail in the corral." He held it out, and she saw the long, L-shaped rip in the shoulder seam. It was a nasty tear that would require careful work to fix without weakening the leather. "I can mend that," she said, taking the heavy coat from him. The leather was cool and smelled faintly of horses. Rain. And the man himself. She ran her fingers along the tear. "I'll need to put a reinforcing patch on the inside to hold the seam. I have some sturdy canvas that will do the job." "Whatever you think is best," he said. She expected him to leave then, to say he would be back tomorrow. Instead, he surprised her. "Mind if I wait?" he asked, his gaze indicating the single chair in the corner of her room. Clara was taken aback. No one had ever asked to sit in her room. No one had wanted to stay. "Of course," she managed to say. He walked past her and sat down, placing his hat on his knee. And then he fell silent. It was the most extraordinary thing. He simply sat. He didn't stare at her, his eyes instead resting on the rough-sawn planks of the far wall. He didn't try to make small talk or ask intrusive questions. He just occupied the chair, his presence a quiet, steady weight in the small room. The silence should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It was peaceful. For the first time, Clara felt she could work without the prickling sensation of being judged. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire in her small stove and the whisper of her waxed thread as she pulled it through the tough hide. She worked with intense focus, her stitches small, tight, and even. It was a difficult repair, but she took a fierce pride in making it perfect. After a long while, as the light outside began to fade, he spoke, his voice not breaking the silence but becoming a part of it. "You need anything?" The question was so simple, so unexpected, that she stopped her needle mid-stitch. He wasn't asking if she needed help with the coat. His tone was broader, more encompassing. He was asking about her life in this small, cold room. He was asking if she was all right. No one had asked her that since she had left Kansas. She looked at him, truly looked at him, sitting there in the growing twilight. He wasn't handsome in the way Elias had been. His face was too weathered, his features too rugged. But there was an integrity to his face, a deep, abiding calm in his slate-gray eyes that she was beginning to see as a rare and profound kind of beauty. "No, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I have everything I need right here." He gave a single, slow nod, and the silence returned, more comfortable than before. When she was finished, she held the coat up for his inspection. The seam was strong, the stitches nearly invisible against the dark hide. "That's good work," he said, his voice holding genuine appreciation. He stood, pulling a few coins from his pocket. He paid her exactly what she asked, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric moment as she took the money. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. He put on the duster, settling its familiar weight on his shoulders, put on his hat, and left. Clara stood in her doorway and watched him walk away, his tall form swallowed by the deepening twilight. That night, She slept more soundly than she had since arriving in Silver Creek. His first visit set a new pattern. A few days later, he returned with a saddle blanket that had a frayed edge. Again, he sat in the chair while she worked, a quiet, reassuring presence in the corner of her room. He did not speak unless she spoke first, and his only question, asked just before he left, was always the same, "You need anything?" The week after that, it was a pair of thick leather work gloves, one of which had a split seam, then a flannel shirt, identical to the one he always wore. That was missing a button. Each time, he would bring his mending, sit in quiet companionship while she repaired it, pay her fairly, and ask his simple, searching question. His visits became small, solid anchor points in her week. The townspeople still kept their distance, the women with their wary eyes, the men with their leering jokes. But it began to matter less. For an hour or two, twice a week, she was not the strange, tall woman of Silver Creek. She was just Clara, a seamstress, sitting in a quiet room with a man who respected her work and, in his own silent way, seemed to respect her. It was a start. The slow, tentative roots of belonging that Clara had begun to put down in the soil of Silver Creek were fragile things, easily damaged. For weeks, she had found a quiet rhythm in her life, a sense of purpose defined by the steady work of her hands and the peaceful solitude of her small room. The twice-weekly visits from Calder Boone had become the unassuming cornerstones of her existence, small moments of quiet respect that fortified her against the town's general indifference. She had begun to feel that here, perhaps, she could build a life based on her skills, not her stature. She had begun to hope. It was a Tuesday afternoon when that hope was dealt a heavy blow. The Reverend had asked if she might be so kind as to restitch the seams on several of the velvet collection bags, which were worn thin from years of hopeful passing. She finished the work quickly, the rich, dark fabric feeling smooth and cool under her fingers. Carrying the repaired bags, she walked from her room into the main church hall, intending to leave them on the pulpit for the Reverend to find. The church was empty of men, but not of voices. From the small meeting room off the chancel, where the ladies of the town held their sewing circle and planned church suppers, she heard the low murmur of conversation. She recognized the sharp, commanding tones of Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, and the thinner, more reedy voice of Mrs. Pritchard, who ran the general store. Clara had no intention of eavesdropping. She meant only to place the bags and retreat to her sanctuary. But as she neared the pulpit, a single, clear phrase cut through the air and stopped her in her tracks. "And so tall, for heaven's sake, it's unnatural." "Mrs." Pritchard was saying, her voice laced with a prim disapproval, like a man in a dress. A cold dread coiled in Clara's stomach. She stood frozen in the shadowed aisle, hidden from the doorway of the meeting room. "Her stitching is fine, I'll grant you that, Mrs." Gable conceded, her voice grudging. "She fixed my boy's trousers better than new, but what good is a needle when a woman stands a head taller than any potential husband? A man wants a wife to look down on, to protect, not that." The word hung in the air, asterisk, that asterisk, an object, a thing to be measured and found wanting. My Elias in Kansas wrote to me about a woman like that once. A third voice chimed in. One Clara didn't recognize. Said she was comely enough in the face, but her height was an embarrassment. Of course, he found himself a proper, petite little thing to marry in the end. It's only right. Who would want to stand at the altar next to a woman who makes him look like a boy? Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Asterisk alias, asterisk. It couldn't be a coincidence. The world suddenly felt very small and very cruel. They were talking about her, picking her apart with the casual, thoughtless cruelty of women who had always fit within the comfortable confines of society's expectations. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed. The old shame, the humiliation she had fled 1,000 miles to escape, came rushing back in a suffocating wave. She felt an overwhelming urge to shrink, to fold in on herself until she disappeared. Her shoulders, which she had been consciously holding straight and proud, began to slump. She felt the familiar ache in her upper back from a lifetime of trying to make herself smaller. They were right. She was unnatural. She was an oddity. And she had been a fool to think that changing her location could change that fundamental, unalterable fact. Clutching the velvet bags to her chest, she backed away silently, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the wooden floor. She fled the church, the women's voices fading behind her, their careless laughter like stones thrown at her retreating back. She didn't stop until she was safely inside her own room. The heavy wooden door shut tight against the world. She leaned against it, her eyes closed, her breathing ragged. The room, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison cell. The walls seemed to be closing in, the single window offering a view only of the impassive, judging pines. She dropped the collection bags onto her work table, their soft weight a mockery of the burden in her soul. She sank into her chair, her work forgotten, her hands lying limp in her lap. For hours, she sat motionless as the afternoon bled into evening, the light in her room fading from gray to a deep, bruised purple. She was back in Kansas, standing in the middle of the mercantile while Elias's father publicly dismantled her worth. She was a girl again, watching the other children choose partners for a dance, always left standing alone against the wall. A solitary pine in a field of daisies. The wound she thought had begun to scar over was ripped open anew, and it felt deeper and more painful than ever before. She didn't hear the footsteps on the gravel path outside until they stopped at her door. A soft, hesitant knock followed. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend she was asleep or away. But there was only one person who ever came to her door in the evening. "Come in," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. The door opened, and Calder Boone stepped inside, bringing the chill of the night air with him. He was carrying something large and heavy. Draped over his arm, a thick blanket made from the pelt of a great gray wolf, its fur tipped with silver. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw her sitting there, a still silhouette against the fading light from the window. "Evening, Miss Hollis," he said, his voice quiet. He held up the blanket. The stitchings come loose along the edge where the leather backing meets the fur. "Wondered if you could fix it." Clara didn't rise. She couldn't seem to find the energy. She merely nodded toward the table. "Leave it there. I'll look at it in the morning." Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual quiet warmth. Calder didn't move toward the table. He stood by the door, his gaze fixed on her. He was an observant man, a man who had learned to read the subtle signs of a nervous horse or a shift in the weather. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the unnatural stillness of her hands, the way her head was bowed, her chin tucked toward her chest as if she were trying to hide. He had never seen her look this way. He had only ever seen her stand tall, her spine straight as a gun barrel, meeting the world head-on. He took a slow step into the room, letting the door click shut behind him. The silence stretched, thick with her unspoken misery. He didn't offer empty pleasantries. He went straight to the heart of it. "Who's been making you carry your head so low, Miss Hollis?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm, a question that was not an intrusion but an invitation. The directness of it startled her. She looked up, and in the faint moonlight slanting through the window, she could see the genuine concern in his eyes. There was no pity there, only a quiet demand for the truth. Something inside her, a wall she had kept carefully guarded for years, began to crumble. It was the way he'd phrased it, not "what's wrong," but "who did this to you?" He had assigned blame. The words came out in a torrent, a quiet, desperate confession. "I heard them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The women in the church, they said what's always been said, that I'm too tall, that I'm unnatural, that no man would have me." The final words were barely audible. She then told him a piece of the story she had never intended to share with anyone, a shame she had carried alone. "There was a man back home. He courted me. I thought he didn't mind my height. But his family said I would be an embarrassment, that a man shouldn't have to stand on his toes to kiss his own wife. He listened to them." She didn't say Elias's name. It was a poison she wouldn't speak aloud. "Today, I was reminded that it doesn't matter where I go. I will always be too much." She finished, her gaze falling back to her lap, expecting him to shift uncomfortably, to offer some useless, placating phrase and then leave as quickly as possible. This was her burden, her shame. She had no right to place it on his shoulders. Calder didn't move. He stood there, the heavy wolf pelt still draped over his arm, and simply listened. He let her words settle in the quiet room. When she was done, he was silent for a long moment. Not a silence of discomfort, but of consideration. He looked at her, slumped in her chair, a proud, strong woman brought low by the small-minded words of others. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate with a fierce, protective anger. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small space with a sense of solidity, of safety. "My father was a short man," Calder said, his voice even. "My mother was nearly a head taller than him. I remember hearing folks whisper behind their hands when they walked into church. I saw the smirks." He paused, letting the image settle. "My father never noticed. Or if he did, he never cared. He used to say that a man who worries about the height of his wife is a man who's afraid he won't measure up in other ways." He looked directly at Clara, his slate-gray eyes boring through the twilight, straight into hers. "Only the weak are afraid of someone who stands tall." The words were not a comfort. They were a revelation. They were a sword, cutting through the tangled knots of shame and self-doubt that had bound her for years. It had never, not once, occurred to her to see it that way. She had always accepted the blame, always believed that the fault lay in her own unnatural frame. Calder's words shifted the entire world on its axis. The fault was not in her for being a mountain. It was in them for being afraid of the climb. A single tear, hot and cleansing, escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply looked at him, this quiet, steady man. And for the first time, she let him see all the way in, past the composure and the pride, to the hurt that lay beneath. He held her gaze, his own expression unwavering, a silent promise that he was not afraid of what he saw. The wolf pelt lay forgotten on the table, a wild, untamed thing in a room that suddenly felt a little less like a prison and a little more like a haven. Calder's words had been a shield, one he had handed her in the dark of her small room. In the days that followed, Clara found herself holding it up against the slights and stares of the town, when Mrs. Pritchard gave her a pitying look over the counter at the general store. Clara remembered Calder's father, who never cared that his wife was taller. When a pair of loggers smirked at her on the street, she heard Calder's voice in her head asterisk, "Only the weak are afraid of someone who stands tall." The words did not make the hurt disappear, but they changed its nature. The shame, which had always felt like an internal failing, now seemed like an external force, a foolishness that belonged to others, not to her. He continued to bring his mending, and their quiet ritual resumed. But something had changed. The silence between them was now imbued with a new weight, a shared understanding. The empty chair in the corner of her room no longer felt like a visitor's spot. It felt like his. One evening, nearly a week after she had confessed her story to him, he arrived at his usual time, but his hands were empty. There was no torn shirt, no saddle blanket in need of her needle. He stood in her doorway, turning the brim of his hat in his hands, a gesture she was coming to recognize as a sign of his rare uncertainty. "Miss Hollis," he began, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "The town is holding its harvest social on Saturday, end of the logging season before the snows come." He paused, and then finally looked at her, his gaze direct, There's music, a dance. I was wondering if you might care to go." Clara's heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. Go to a public gathering with him. The idea was both terrifying and intoxicating. Her first instinct was to say no. A wall of fear rose up in her, built from a lifetime of social humiliations. She pictured it instantly walking into the town square beside Calder Boone. They would be a spectacle, a landmark. The whispers would follow them like a cloud of biting flies. The women from the church would stare. The men from the saloon would make their crude jokes. It would be Kansas all over again. But worse, because this time, she would not be alone in her humiliation. She would be subjecting him to it as well. "Mr. Boone, that is a very kind invitation," she began, her voice formal as she searched for the words to refuse him gently. "But I am not much for crowds. I fear I would not be good company." He didn't argue. He just held her gaze, his expression calm and steady. "You wouldn't have to be in the crowd," he said quietly. "We could just be there, stand on the edge of things. No one says you have to dance, but a person ought to hear some live music now and then. It's good for the spirit." He wasn't asking her to be a social butterfly. He wasn't asking her to change. He was simply offering her a chance to exist, to occupy a small piece of the world for an evening, with him by her side. He understood her fear without her having to explain it, and he was offering a way through it. He was offering her his shield. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but a different feeling was rising to meet it, a flicker of longing, a desire to not let the whispers of small-minded people dictate the entire course of her life. She looked at Calder, at his quiet strength and the unwavering respect in his eyes, and she found a courage she didn't know she possessed. "All right, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the evening air. "I will go with you." A slow, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it transformed his rugged face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "I'll come for you Saturday, after sundown," he said, and with a nod, he was gone. On Saturday evening, Clara prepared with the meticulous care of a soldier arming for battle. She washed her face and hands with the harsh lye soap until her skin was tingling and clean. She brushed out her long, dark hair, its weight heavy in her hands. Before coiling it into its usual severe bun, she reasoned that if her hair was tidy and her collar was straight, it would give people less to criticize. She put on her best dress. It was a deep blue calico, the color of a twilight sky, with a simple white linen collar. She had made it herself, of course, and it fit her perfectly, the darts and seams all tailored to her tall, straight frame. It was not a fashionable garment, but it was dignified, and in its simple lines, she felt a sense of her own worth as she looked at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror above her washstand. She saw a woman who was nervous, yes, but also one who was determined. She would not slump tonight. She would stand as tall as God had made her and let the world think what it would. Calder arrived as the last light was draining from the sky. He was dressed differently than she had ever seen him. He wore a clean, dark shirt and trousers, and his heavy horsehide duster had been replaced by a smart wool coat. He had even made an attempt to tame his thick, dark hair with a wet comb. He looked impossibly tall and steady, a bulwark against the night. The town square was transformed. Lanterns had been strung from the roof of the general store to the blacksmith's shop, casting a warm, flickering glow over the scene. The air, crisp with the coming autumn, was thick with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and sweet apple cider. In the center of the square, on a platform built of raw lumber, a trio of musicians, a fiddler with a great white beard, a young man on guitar, and a banjo player who tapped his foot with infectious energy were tuning their instruments. The entire town seemed to be there. Children chased each other through the crowd, their shrieks of laughter rising into the night. Women stood in gossiping clusters, their colorful dresses a bright patchwork in the lantern light. Men passed around bottles and flasks, their voices loud and boisterous. It was a chaotic, swirling sea of humanity. And as Clara stepped into it with Calder at her side, she felt a familiar wave of panic. The whispers started immediately. She didn't have to hear the words to know what was being said. She saw it in the way heads turned, the way conversations paused as they passed, the way eyes widened and followed them. She felt the old instinct to shrink, to duck her head. But then she felt Calder's hand, warm and calloused, touch her elbow. It wasn't a possessive grip, just a light, steadying pressure. It was enough. She lifted her chin and kept walking. True to his word, he didn't lead her into the heart of the crowd. He guided her to the edge of the wide boardwalk in front of the livery stable. There, leaning back against the sturdy porch posts, they had a perfect view of the festivities without being consumed by them. They were in the light, but not on the stage. From this vantage point, the world seemed to slow down. They stood in a comfortable silence, a pair of quiet observers on the edge of the chaos. The fiddle struck up a lively, foot-stomping reel, and a dozen couples surged into the center of the square, their boots kicking up dust as they spun and laughed. "Mr. Abernathy is going to lose his hat," Calder observed quietly, nodding toward a portly merchant who was dancing with far more enthusiasm than grace. Clara watched as the man's hat flew from his head, and a genuine smile touched her lips. "Mrs. Abernathy looks as though she wishes it had been him," she replied, her voice dry. Calder chuckled, a low, pleasant sound, in that small, shared moment of humor. Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. They were not a spectacle. They were just two people, watching the world go by. The stares and whispers continued. She was sure, but they had lost their power. Calder's presence was a shield, his complete lack of concern for the opinions of others creating a small pocket of peace around them. He watched the dancers with an easy amusement, his focus entirely on the scene before him, making it clear to anyone who looked that he was exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the person he wanted to be with. The musicians finished the reel with a flourish and, after a brief pause, began a new song. The melody was slower, sweeter, a waltz. The raw energy of the crowd softened, and couples moved together in a more graceful, intimate rhythm. The lantern light seemed to grow warmer, the shadows deeper. Clara watched them, a strange ache in her chest. She had never danced with a man. She had never been asked. At town socials back home, she had been a permanent fixture against the wall, a lonely sentinel watching others experience a joy she was sure she would never know. Calder shifted beside her, pushing away from the post he'd been leaning on. He turned to face her, the lantern light catching the serious, kind expression in his eyes. He said nothing. He simply held out his hand. It was an invitation. It was a question. It was a challenge. To take his hand would be to step out of the shadows for good. It would mean walking into the center of the light, into the center of all those staring eyes, and declaring that she had a right to be there. The fear, which had been dormant, rushed back. "Oh, no," she said, a small, nervous laugh escaping her. "I couldn't. I'm not a dancer." She looked down at his feet and then at her own. "I would step all over you." Calder didn't retract his hand. He waited, his patience as solid and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. "I'm wearing high boots, Miss Hollis," he said, his voice low and steady, meant for her ears alone. He glanced down at his sturdy leather boots, then met her eyes again. "They're built to withstand a great deal. I expect they can manage." His words, as always, went deeper than their surface meaning. He wasn't just talking about his boots. He was talking about himself. He was strong enough. He would not be diminished or embarrassed. He could take the weight. She looked at his outstretched hand. It was large, calloused from work, but it was offered with such gentle certainty. It was the hand of a man who gentled wild horses, who mended what was broken, who believed that even the tallest trees had a right to reach for the sun. Taking it was the most terrifying and the most hopeful thing she had ever considered doing. Slowly, her heart pounding a rhythm that matched the waltz, she raised her own hand and placed it in his. The passing of the seasons in the high country was not a gentle transition, but a sudden, decisive shift. The vibrant gold of the aspens seemed to appear overnight, a fiery blush against the deep green of the pines. And just as quickly, the leaves were stripped by a sharp, cold wind, leaving the trees like stark, bare skeletons. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying the promise of snow on its breath. With the change in the weather came a change in the nature of Clara's work. The town was battening down for winter. She was no longer just mending simple tiers. She was reinforcing seams on heavy wool coats, patching canvas wagon covers, and lining worn blankets with flannel for extra warmth. Her small business was, to her quiet astonishment, beginning to thrive. The women of the town, while still not warm, had developed a grudging respect for her skill. They now came to her not just for mending, but for more complex tasks. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, had commissioned her to turn a pair of old wool blankets into a heavy winter coat for her youngest son. Mrs. Davies, who ran the general store, paid her to sew a new set of sturdy canvas curtains for the shop's large front windows to keep out the winter drafts. Each completed task was a testament to her worth, a stitch in the fabric of her new life. She was no longer just the strange, tall woman. She was the seamstress, a necessary part of the town's machinery. Her relationship with Calder had settled into a comfortable, unspoken pattern. He no longer needed the pretense of a torn glove or a missing button to visit her. He would often stop by at the end of his day, ostensibly to see if she needed a cord of wood chopped for her stove or a bucket of fresh water hauled from the well. They would sit in the quiet of her room, the only light from her oil lamp, and talk. He spoke of his horses, of the subtle language of their movements, and of the patience required to earn their trust. She spoke of her work, of the different textures of fabric, and of the satisfaction of creating something strong and useful with her own two hands. They were quiet conversations, but in them, they were building something as sturdy and as carefully stitched as one of her repaired seams. One crisp afternoon, Clara walked to the general store to purchase a new supply of the thick, waxed thread she needed for working with leather. The bell above the door gave a cheerful jingle as she entered, the air inside warm and smelling of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and cinnamon misses. Davies was behind the counter, measuring out flour for another customer. Clara gave her a nod and moved toward the back of the store, where the notions and dry goods were kept. As she was examining the spools of thread, the bell above the door jingled again. A man's voice, unfamiliar but laced with an arrogant, easy confidence, filled the small space. "Good day, madam. I'm looking for the finest cigars you carry and a bottle of your best whiskey." Clara didn't look up. The voice was that of a city man, out of place in this rough-hewn town. She selected her thread and turned to bring it to the counter, and then she saw him. Her breath caught in her throat, a painful, sharp gasp. The world seemed to tilt and blur, the sounds of the store fading to a distant roar in her ears. It was him. It was Elias. No, not Elias. The name she had known him by was a softer, gentler thing. This man was Lucas Pritchard. He was dressed in a fine, tailored wool suit, his boots polished to a high shine despite the town's muddy streets. His hair was perfectly combed, his face clean-shaven, revealing the same charming, handsome features she had once thought she would love for a lifetime. But now, she saw the weakness in his jaw, the petulant set of his mouth that she had mistaken for sensitivity. He stood at the counter, exuding an air of wealth and superiority, a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. For a paralyzing moment, she was the girl from Kansas again. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. and her first instinct was to turn, to flee, to hide herself in the back of the store until he was gone. All the old wounds, the ones she thought were healing, tore open, raw and bleeding. He hadn't seen her yet. He was speaking to Mrs. Davies, his tone condescending as he inspected the bottle she offered him. Clara forced her feet to move. She had to get out. She walked toward the counter, her head down, her eyes fixed on the worn floorboards, praying he wouldn't look up. But he did. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a low, incredulous drawl. He had been turning from the counter, and his eyes fell upon her. The cigar he had been about to light paused halfway to his lips. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. Clara May Hollis. What in God's name are you doing at the edge of creation? His eyes raked over her, from her plain, serviceable dress to the calloused tips of her fingers, which were clutching the spool of thread so tightly her knuckles were white. He took in her height, the same feature that had once been the source of his family's disgust, and his smile widened, full of a cruel amusement. Clara's heart was hammering against her ribs, but through the roar of panic, Calder's voice echoed in her mind, "Only the weak are afraid of someone who stands tall." She forced herself to meet Lucas's gaze. She lifted her chin. She would not cower. Not anymore. "I live here, Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She was surprised at how calm she sounded. "This is my home." His gaze swept around the rustic, cluttered store, and he gave a short, derisive laugh. This is your home. I heard you'd run off somewhere out west after our misunderstanding. I never imagined you'd land in a place like this. My, how the mighty have fallen." It was then that Mrs. Davies, who had been watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity, spoke up. "Clara's our seamstress," she said, her tone defensive, "and a fine one at that. She does good work for the whole town." Lucas's eyebrows shot up in feigned surprise. He turned his mocking gaze back to Clara. "A seamstress? Is that what you do now? Mending clothes for lumberjacks?" He gestured vaguely toward the door, where a man who looked suspiciously like Calder Boone was just tying the reins of his horse to the hitching post. Calder hadn't seen them. He was checking one of his horse's shoes. The sight of him, solid and real, sent a surge of strength through Clara. Lucas, oblivious, continued his attack. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, insulting whisper. "So, you've traded the chance to be a respectable preacher's wife for sewing shirts for cowboys. Have you a poor trade?" Clara May, a very poor trade. The insult was perfectly crafted, designed to remind her of her failed engagement, to belittle her current life, and to mock the man she now kept company with. The Clara of 6 months ago would have withered under the contempt in his voice. She would have flushed with shame, stammered an apology, and fled. But she was no longer that woman. She had survived a 1,000-mile journey alone. She had built a business with her own 2 hands. She had faced down loneliness and ridicule and earned a place for herself. And she had found the quiet, unwavering respect of a man whose worth was not measured in polished boots or fine wool suits. A strange, cold calm settled over her. She looked Lucas Pritchard directly in the eye, and for the first time she saw him not as the handsome charmer who had broken her heart, but as a weak, cruel boy, a pale reflection of his powerful father. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth. "I've learned that a man's worth has little to do with his title. Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice as clear and cold as the mountain air. She allowed her gaze to drift for a moment toward the window, where Calder was now striding toward the door, his long, easy gait a study in understated confidence. She turned her eyes back to Lucas, her smile hardening. "And I must say," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, drawing him in, "I've never seen a preacher who could ride a horse half as well as the man who wears the clothes I mend." The words landed with the sharp, clean impact of a slap. She had not only defended her choice, She had praised Calder's rugged masculinity in the same breath that she had belittled Lucas's more civilized, but ultimately weaker, world. She had taken his insult and turned it back on him like a sharpened blade. Lucas's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His face flushed a dull, angry red. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He was, for the first time in his life, utterly speechless. He had come expecting to find a broken, lonely spinster whom he could pity and mock. He had instead found a woman of iron, a woman who looked at him not with regret, but with a cool, dismissive contempt. At that moment, the bell above the door jingled, and Calder Boone stepped inside. He took in the scene at a glance, Clara, standing tall and straight, her eyes flashing with a cold fire he had never seen before, and the well-dressed stranger opposite her, his face a mask of shocked fury. Calder's gaze met Clara's, and a silent question passed between them. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a signal that she was all right, that she had handled it. He walked to the counter, his presence seeming to suck all the air from the room. He stood beside Clara, a silent, solid wall of support. He didn't look at Lucas. He addressed Mrs. Davies. "Afternoon, Martha," he said, his voice its usual calm rumble. "Just came for that bag of oats." The spell was broken. Lucas Pritchard, flustered and outmaneuvered, threw a few coins on the counter for his whiskey, snatched the bottle, and stalked out of the store without another word, his grand exit ruined. Clara stood at the counter, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Calder placed his large hand on the counter next to hers, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth and strength radiating from him. He still didn't ask what had happened. He knew he didn't have to. She looked at him, her heart filled with a fierce, soaring gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. He finally turned to look at her, a deep, approving warmth in his slate-gray eyes. "You didn't need me," he said, and he was right. She hadn't. A man like Lucas Pritchard, whose entire sense of self was built upon a foundation of wealth, privilege, and the admiring opinions of others, could not tolerate public humiliation. Clara's cool, dismissive retort in the general store had done more than silence him. It had stripped him of his perceived superiority in front of an audience of common townspeople. He had been made to look foolish by the very woman he had scorned, and his wounded pride festered into a venomous, spiteful malice. He did not leave Silver Creek. To flee would be to admit defeat. Instead, he sought to restore his dominance in the only way he knew how, by destroying the reputation of the person who had challenged him. His chosen battlefield was the smoky, whiskey-soaked confines of the Silver Dollar Saloon, the town's beating heart of gossip and ill repute. Lucas was a man who understood the currency of influence. He bought a bottle of his expensive whiskey and set it on the bar, a silent invitation to any man with a thirsty throat and a ready ear. He began to talk, his voice a carefully pitched performance of a wronged, reasonable man. He didn't shout or rage. He spoke with a sigh of regret, painting a picture of his past with Clara May Hollis that was a masterpiece of twisted truths and outright lies. In his telling, their broken engagement was not his doing, but hers. He spoke of a woman who was headstrong and willful, unsettled in her spirit. He called it a phrase that was both vague and damning. He hinted at a forwardness that was not becoming in a respectable woman, implying she had ambitions beyond the proper domestic sphere. He never said she was unchaste. That would have been too direct, too easily challenged. Instead, he used insinuation and suggestion, planting seeds of doubt about her character. "A man wants a gentle, pious woman for a wife," he said to the circle of miners and loggers who had gathered around him, drawn by the free liquor, "not a woman who thinks she knows better than a man. A woman who stands so tall she's always looking down on you. It's a shame. I tried to guide her, but her nature was too stubborn." He had found the perfect poison in a town like Silver Creek, where life was hard and the roles of men and women were carved in stone. A woman's independence was not a virtue, but a suspicion. His story preyed on the town's existing prejudices. The whispers that had once been about the novelty of her height now took on a darker, more judgmental tone. Lucas's lies gave the townspeople permission to dislike her, to see her not as a skilled seamstress, but as a woman of questionable character, a woman who had been cast out of polite society for good reason. The poison spread quickly. Gossip was the town's primary form of entertainment, and this was a particularly juicy vintage. The story was retold and embellished as it moved from the saloon to the sawmill, from the sawmill to the front porches of the town's small houses. By the next morning, the very air in Silver Creek seemed to have changed. Clara felt it the moment she stepped out of her room to fetch water from the well. A group of women, who the day before would have given her a civil, if cool, nod, now fell silent as she approached, turning their backs to her and resuming their conversation in hushed, urgent whispers only after she had passed. At the general store, Mrs. Davies was polite but distant, her movements stiff and her eyes refusing to meet Clara's. The men were worse. Their previous leering jokes were replaced by a knowing, insolent smirk. Their eyes now held a new, uglier appraisal, as if her rumored improper past made her public property. The work, for the first time, began to dry up. A woman who had commissioned a new winter dress for her daughter sent her son with a note, saying she had changed her mind. Another customer who was due to pick up a mended coat failed to appear. Clara understood. To associate with her now was to risk one's own reputation. They were closing ranks, casting her out. She retreated into the sanctuary of her small room. But the cold of the town's disapproval seeped through the walls. She kept working, her hands finding solace in the familiar, steady rhythm of the needle. She mended the wolf pelt blanket for Calder, her stitches as small and perfect as ever, her focus absolute. Her work was the one thing they could not take from her. It was her truth, her testament. When she had to walk through town, she did so with her spine rigid, her head held high, her gaze fixed on a point in the distance. She would not let them see her break. But inside, she was weathering a storm. It was not the sharp, public humiliation of Kansas. This was a slow, grinding erosion of the life she had so carefully built. It was the injustice that ate at her. The knowledge that a man's lies could be more powerful than the truth of her own hard work and quiet dignity. Calder saw it all. He was a man who lived on the edge of the town, both literally and figuratively, and he had a clear view of its machinations. He heard the talk in the livery stable, saw the smug, self-satisfied look on Lucas Pritchard's face as he held court in the saloon. Most of all, he saw the effect it was having on Clara. He saw the new tension in her shoulders, the deep, bruised sadness that she tried to hide behind her composed expression, and it stirred a cold, quiet rage deep inside him. He waited until full darkness had fallen, until the town had settled into its evening routines and the lamps were lit in the windows. He walked to a room at the back of the church, his long strides eating up the ground. He knocked once, a sharp, decisive rap of his knuckles on the wood. When she opened the door, her face was pale in the lamplight. She looked tired, the strain of the past few days etched in the fine lines around her eyes. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice betraying a hint of surprise. He stepped inside, filling the small room with his presence. He took off his hat, his movements tight and controlled. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've heard the talk," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Pritchard, he's been spreading his poison all over town." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, a small, protective gesture. She nodded, her gaze falling to the floor. "A lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its boots on," she whispered, the old saying tasting like ash in her mouth. He took a step closer, his anger a palpable force in the room. It was not a hot, uncontrolled rage, but something colder, harder, and far more dangerous. It was the anger of a patient man pushed too far. He looked at her, at the proud woman being brought low by the cowardly whispers of a lesser man, and the injustice of it was more than he could bear. "Do you want me to stop him?" he asked, his voice flat, every word loaded with deadly intent. He looked her directly in the eye. "I can go to him. I can make it clear to him that he is no longer welcome in this town. I will make him understand the error of his ways." The offer hung in the air between them. It was a promise of violence, of direct and brutal intervention. He was offering to fight for her, to be her champion, to physically defend her honor against the man who was trying to destroy it. It was the ultimate gesture of protection. The code of the West made plain a man defends his own. A great, soaring wave of gratitude washed over Clara, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. To have someone, for the first time in her life, willing to stand in front of her and take on her battles, it was a gift of unimaginable price. The lonely, frightened girl inside her wanted to weep, to say yes, to let this strong, good man solve this problem she could not seem to solve herself. But as she looked at him, at the fierce loyalty burning in his slate-gray eyes, she realized that to accept his offer would be to betray the very woman he saw in her. He respected her because she was strong. To let him fight her battles would be to admit that she was not. It would be to revert to the woman she had been in Kansas, a woman who needed a man's approval to feel whole. She straightened her shoulders, letting her arms fall to her sides. She met his furious gaze with a look of profound, unwavering calm. "No," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "I do not need anyone to fight my battles for me." She saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes. She took a small step closer, her heart aching with the need to make him understand. "But thank you for asking," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "The fact that you were willing to, it means more than you will ever know." Calder. It was the first time she had ever used his given name. It felt both strange and perfectly natural on her tongue. Her refusal was not a rejection of him. It was an affirmation of herself. She was not a damsel in distress in need of rescuing. She was a woman of substance, and her honor was her own to defend. She would not win this battle with fists or threats, as a man would. She would win it with her dignity, her integrity, and the undeniable truth of her character. She was claiming her own power, and in doing so, she was claiming him as an equal, not as a protector. Calder stared at her, the anger in his face slowly giving way to a look of deep, profound respect. He, a man of action, had offered the only solution he knew, and she had countered with a strength he had never encountered before. She was not asking him to stand in front of her. She was asking him to stand beside her, and in that moment, his desire to protect her was eclipsed by a wave of pure, unadulterated admiration. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Clara," he said, his own voice quiet now, the anger gone, replaced by something deeper. "We'll do it your way." Clara's decision to face the town's gossip with quiet dignity rather than retreat was a silent declaration of war, and Calder had honored her choice of weapons. He did not confront Lucas Pritchard, nor did he challenge the men who snickered in the saloon. Instead, he stood with her. When they walked to the mercantile, he stood so close that his presence was an unspoken warning. When customers were scarce at her door, he found a dozen small, unnecessary mending jobs around his ranch, a horse blanket that was perfectly fine, a set of reins with a purely imaginary fray. His loyalty was a quiet, steady flame in the face of the town's cold shoulder, and slowly, imperceptibly, it began to have an effect. People noticed. A man like Calder Boone did not waste his time on trivialities. If he stood by the tall seamstress, there must be more to her than the lies of a fancy-suited stranger. The first snow of the season arrived not as a gentle dusting, but as a furious, white-fanged blizzard that roared down from the mountains with breathtaking speed. It began in the late afternoon, the sky turning the color of a lead ingot. the wind beginning to moan through the pines like a grieving woman. Calder arrived at Clara's door just as the first thick, heavy flakes began to fall. Obscuring the world in a swirling curtain of white, he carried a heavy wool greatcoat, the kind worn against the bitterest cold. "The lining's torn loose near the collar. Clara," he said, shaking the snow from his hat. The wind snatched at the door, trying to rip it from her hand. "I'll need it for the morning if this keeps up." She took the coat, its wool still cold from the outdoors, and saw at once that the repair was a simple one. But as she looked past him, into the maelstrom of the storm, a knot of worry tightened in her chest. His ranch was a good 2-mile ride from town, and the path would already be disappearing under the rapidly accumulating snow. "You can't ride back in this," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "It's not safe. You'll lose the trail." A stubborn set came to his jaw. "I've weathered worse. My stock needs seeing to." "Your stock will be fine in the barn for one night." A new voice chimed in. Reverend Theron, drawn by the sound of their voices and the roar of the wind, stood in the doorway that connected the church to her small room. He held a lantern, its warm glow a small beacon against the encroaching darkness. It would be madness to attempt the ride home. "Son, you will stay here tonight. The Lord provides shelter for all his creatures in a storm, and that includes stubborn cowboys." Calder looked from the Reverend's kind, insistent face to Clara's worried one, and finally at the blinding wall of white outside. He knew they were right. He gave a slow nod of concession. "The cot in here is too small for a man your size," the Reverend continued, his eyes twinkling. "But the kitchen in the parsonage has a long settle bench by the hearth. It's the warmest spot in the house. You will be our guest. And Clara, my dear, you must join us as well. I have a pot of venison stew on the stove, far too much for one old man to eat." And so it was that Clara found herself in the warm, fragrant kitchen of the parsonage, a world away from the howling fury of the blizzard outside. The kitchen was the heart of the Reverend's small house, a cozy, cluttered space dominated by a massive stone hearth where a great log fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the rich smell of the stew, of drying herbs that hung from the rafters, and of wood smoke. The three of them ate at the heavy oak table, the storm providing a constant, wild music outside. The Reverend, a cheerful host, kept the conversation light, telling stories of his first winter in Silver Creek. But as the evening wore on, the old man's energy began to fade. With a final, contented sigh, he declared he was retiring for the night. "Don't you two stay up too late," he said, his eyes moving between them with a knowing, gentle look. "The fire will keep you warm." He left, and a profound, intimate silence settled over the kitchen. They were alone, cocooned in the warmth and light while the world outside raged. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the relentless, screaming wind. Clara took the greatcoat Calder had brought and, seating herself in a rocking chair near the hearth, began to work on the torn lining. Calder sat on the long settle bench opposite her, watching her hands in the firelight. Her fingers, long and nimble, moved with a practiced, graceful economy, the needle dipping and rising in a steady, soothing rhythm. He was quiet for a long time, his expression thoughtful. "My mother's hands moved like that," he said at last, his voice a low, soft rumble. Clara looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. He rarely spoke of his family. "She was a seamstress," he continued, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "Best in the county. Could make a wedding dress out of flour sacks and have it look like silk. She taught me how to mend my own clothes, how to stitch up a saddlebag. Said a man who couldn't handle a needle had no business handling a horse." He smiled faintly. "She was a tall woman. My mother, taller than my father by a good hand's breadth." Clara's heart gave a small, painful thump. She held her breath, waiting. "Folks used to talk, of course," Calder said, his eyes now fixed on the flames. whispered about it behind their hands. Same as they do. Said my father was a small man to be taking such a large wife. Said it wasn't natural. She heard the talk. It hurt her, I think, though she never let on. He fell silent for a moment, and Clara could picture it all, the proud, tall woman and the whispers that followed her. It was her own story, reflected in the past. My father, Calder said, his voice full of a deep, quiet reverence. He never seemed to notice she was taller. Or if he did, he thought it was the grandest thing in the world. He used to say he'd married a queen, and that it was only right he should have to look up to her. He adored her. Anyone with eyes could see it. After a while, the whispers just sort of died out. Couldn't stand up to a thing that strong, I guess. He turned his head and looked at Clara, and in his eyes, she saw the whole story. He was not just telling her about his parents. He was telling her about himself. He was showing her the blueprint of his heart, the source of his own quiet strength, his own indifference to the petty judgments of others. He was telling her that he had seen a love that defied convention, and that he believed in it. The warmth from the fire seemed to spread through her body, a deep, melting heat that uncoiled something in her soul that had been knotted tight for a lifetime. The story of his parents, of a love so strong it silenced gossip, was a balm on the fresh wound of Lucas's lies. In the safety of that warm kitchen, with the storm raging outside and this steady, good man sitting across from her, the last of her defenses crumbled. She put the coat down in her lap. She had to know. She had to ask the question that had been the silent, terrified subtext of her entire life. She looked at him, her heart in her throat, her voice a fragile whisper. In your eyes, Calder, am I a person worth holding on to? The question was a plea, an admission of every insecurity she had ever felt. It was the voice of the girl left against the wall at the dance, the woman publicly shamed in the general store, the seamstress shunned by the very people she served. Asterisk, am I worth the trouble I bring? Asterisk. Calder didn't answer immediately. He pushed himself off the settle and came to her, kneeling on one knee on the hearth rug before her rocking chair. He was now below her, looking up into her face. The firelight cast his rugged features in bronze and shadow, and his slate-gray eyes burned with an intensity that took her breath away. He took the coat from her lap and set it aside, and then he took her hands, her large, capable, needle-pricked hands in his own. Clara, he said, his voice low and raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He held her gaze, and in his, she saw no pity, only a fierce, unwavering certainty. You tell me when to stop, he said, his thumb stroking the backs of her hands. You tell me if I'm moving too fast, or if this is not what you want. You are the one who sets the pace. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sacred vow spoken in the heart of the storm. Because I am not stopping. I won't stop, not unless you tell me to. It was not a pretty promise or a flowery declaration of love. It was something far more profound. He was handing her all the very power that had been used against her for her entire life. He was giving her the reins. He was telling her that her worth was not something for him to decide or bestow. It was a given, an absolute truth. His pursuit of her was a foregone conclusion. The only variable was her. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and cleansing, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of pure, unadulterated relief, a lifetime of tension, of holding her breath, of waiting for the next judgment, the next rejection. Simply let go. And for the first time in her life, Clara May Hollis smiled. It was not the small, polite smile she gave to customers, nor the wry, guarded smile she had occasionally shared with Calder. This smile was a revelation. It was born deep inside her, a radiant, unguarded light that broke across her face like the sun rising over the mountains. It was a smile of absolute freedom, a smile that reached her stormy gray eyes and set them alight. It was the smile of a woman who, for the first time, truly believed she was home. The night of the blizzard was a turning point, a quiet cataclysm that shifted the foundations of their lives. After that night, there were no more pretenses. Calder Boone was courting Clara May Hollis. It was a fact as solid and visible as the mountains that ringed the town. He no longer invented mending jobs. He came to her door simply to walk with her to the general store. His presence a silent, unwavering declaration. He would leave a brace of grouse on her doorstep in the morning, or a small, intricately carved wooden bird on her windowsill in the evening. These were not the flowery, public gestures of a city suitor. They were the quiet, meaningful gifts of a man of the West, offerings of substance and skill. The town watched, and the gossip, which had quieted after Lucas Pritchard's ignominious departure, found new life. It was no longer a question of Clara's character, but of Calder's sanity. What could a man like him, strong, capable, the most respected horseman in the territory, possibly see in her? The women's sewing circle buzzed with theories. Mrs. Gable opined that he felt sorry for her. Mrs. Pritchard, still smarting from the events in her store, suggested that a man who spent all his time with horses probably had strange tastes to begin with. The talk was a constant, low-level hum of disapproval, a cloud of gnats that followed them wherever they went. Clara heard it, of course. She felt it in the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, in the lingering, speculative glances that followed her down the street. But the whispers had lost their power to wound her. Calder's simple, steadfast presence was a constant rebuttal to their every doubt. He had looked into her soul and had not found her wanting. He had offered her the reins of their courtship. Beside him, she felt not just tall, but strong. Her height no longer a liability, but a simple attribute, like the color of her eyes. She carried herself with a new, quiet confidence, a woman who knew her own worth because it was reflected back at her every day in the eyes of a good man. Their relationship was a thing of quiet spaces. It lived in the shared silence as they watched the sun set behind the peaks, in the brief touch of his hand on her elbow as he helped her over a patch of ice, in the way he would listen, his head cocked, as she spoke of the intricate challenges of her work. It was a bond built not on grand declarations, but on 1,000 small moments of mutual respect. The brutal cold of deep winter finally broke, giving way to the messy, muddy promise of spring. The snow retreated up the mountainsides, and the roaring creeks, swollen with meltwater, filled the air with a constant, energetic thunder. It was the season for breaking wild horses, a dangerous, necessary work that was Calder's specialty. He had a contract to supply 12 steady mounts for a cattle drive heading north to the Montana Territory, and his days were spent in the corral with the raw, untamed energy of wild mustangs. The news came on a Tuesday, brought by a breathless young boy from Calder's ranch. He burst into the parsonage where Clara was sharing a midday meal with the Reverend, his face pale with panic. "It's Mr. Boone," he gasped, his chest heaving. "One of the new mustangs, a big buckskin. It went over backwards on him. He ain't moving right. Miss Hollis, the doc's away at a birthing over in the next county. Jeb sent me to fetch help." A cold, metallic fear seized Clara. The world narrowed to the boy's terrified face. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to ask questions or wring her hands. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly on the wooden floor. "Reverend," she said, her voice sharp and commanding, "get your medical bag. The one with the laudanum and the carbolic soap. I'll need clean linen for bandages. Lots of it." Without waiting for a reply, she was gone. Striding to her room, she stripped the clean, crisp sheets from her own cot, her shears flashing as she tore them into long, neat strips. She grabbed her sturdiest needles and a spool of thick, waxed thread. She worked with a frantic, focused efficiency, her mind clear and cold. There was no room for panic, only for action. When she emerged moments later, the Reverend was waiting with his bag, his face a mask of concern. She took it from him. "I'm going to his ranch. Tell Jeb, the boy who came, to saddle the gentlest mare you have." "My dear," Should you, the Reverend began, his brow furrowed with worry. A woman at a bachelor's ranch. The talk. Clara turned, her stormy gray eyes flashing with a fire the old man had never seen. Let them talk, she said, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. A man is hurt. The ride to the ranch was a blur of mud and churning hooves. She pushed the mare harder than she should have, her mind racing ahead of her. When she arrived, the scene in the main corral confirmed her worst fears. A group of anxious-looking ranch hands stood in a helpless circle. In the center, lying on a makeshift bed of horse blankets, was Calder. He was conscious, but his face was chalky white and beaded with sweat. His jaw clenched against a pain that was clearly immense. His left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the denim of his trousers already dark with blood from a deep, ragged gash on his thigh where the horse's shod hoof had struck him. She knelt beside him in the mud, her fine dress forgotten. She took his hand. It was cold and clammy. Calder, she said, her voice low and steady, forcing a calm she did not feel. It's Clara. I'm here. His eyes, clouded with pain, focused on her, a flicker of relief. So profound it was almost a sob. Crossed his face. Clara, he breathed. She took control, her voice clear and unwavering, cut through the panicked indecision of the ranch hands. You two, she said, pointing to the strongest-looking men. We need to get him inside. Make a litter with that canvas tarp and 2 of those fence posts. Be careful. Do not jostle his leg. They moved to obey, grateful for the direction. Inside his small, Spartan cabin, she continued to issue orders. Water on the stove to boil. The fire built up high. His bed stripped and remade with the cleanest blankets they could find. For the next 3 days, Clara did not leave his side. She sent one of the hands into town with a list for the general store and a note for the Reverend, informing him that she would not be returning until Calder was out of danger. She left her own business, her own life, on hold. This was the only work that mattered. Her sewing skills, it turned out, were perfectly suited to the sick room. With her shears, she cut away the blood-soaked denim from his leg. Her hands, so accustomed to fine, detailed work, were impossibly gentle as she cleaned the deep, ugly wound with hot water and carbolic soap, her stitches neat and precise as she closed the gash. She set the broken bone as best she could, her strong fingers surprisingly sure, then splinted the leg tightly with pieces of a broken crate and her linen bandages. She nursed him through the fever that followed, bathing his face with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of thin broth between his cracked lips. She sat through the long nights in a chair beside his bed, listening to his pained, restless breathing. The only sounds the pop and hiss of the fire and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distant hills. In the quiet intimacy of that small cabin, watching over the helpless form of this strong man, she felt a love so fierce and protective it was a physical ache in her chest. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Calder woke, his eyes clear for the first time, and found her asleep in the chair, her head slumped at an awkward angle, her face pale with exhaustion. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, her face a mixture of Christian duty and morbid curiosity. She carried a pot of chicken soup, the town's traditional offering in times of crisis. I heard about the accident, she said, her eyes sweeping the cabin, taking in the scene, the neatly bandaged leg, the clean sheets on the bed, and Clara, her hair coming loose from its bun, a smudge of soot on her cheek, looking utterly exhausted but completely in command. Mrs. Gable's gaze lingered on Clara, a flicker of something disapproval, perhaps, or disbelief in her eyes. She set the soup on the table. It's a terrible thing. He'll be laid up for weeks. She looked from Calder's pale face back to Clara. It is good of you to help. Of course, she said, her tone implying it was also highly improper. She lowered her voice. But this kind of work, it requires a delicate touch. a softness. She looked Clara up and down, her meaning clear. A woman so tall, so independent, so unadorned. A woman like you. Where would the softness come from? The question was a direct challenge to her femininity, to her very nature. It was the voice of the sewing circle, the voice of the town, brought into the sanctity of this room. Clara, who had been rinsing a cloth in a bowl of water, stopped. She turned slowly. The damp cloth clutched in her hand. She was tired, so bone-weary she felt transparent, but the insult sparked a core of steel within her. She looked at Mrs. Gable, her gray eyes clear and direct, holding no anger, only an unshakable, quiet certainty. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice low and even. "I make my living with a needle. It is sharp and strong, and it is meant to pierce and to mend what is torn." She paused, letting the words sink in. Then, her gaze flickered for a moment to Calder, who was watching her with a look of fierce pride, and a hint of a smile touched her lips. She turned back to the blacksmith's wife. "But I also have an embrace," she continued, her voice softening just enough to hold a universe of unspoken tenderness. "It is meant to hold and to comfort what is broken." She straightened to her full, magnificent height, a queen in her simple, soot-stained dress. "I own both a needle and a hug," she said, her voice ringing with the clear, simple truth of her soul. "I have learned to know precisely when each is required." Mrs. Gable stood for a moment, her mouth slightly agape, utterly silenced. She had come with a pot of soup and a basket of judgment. She left with only the pot. Clara's steadfast nursing of Calder Boone became the new, defining story of Silver Creek. Her actions had spoken a language the town understood far better than words. It was a language of strength, capability, and a fierce, unwavering loyalty. The tale of how she had taken command, stitched a wound that would have made a grown man faint, and sat vigil for 3 days and nights, spread from the ranch hands to the sawmill, from the sawmill to the general store. It was told with a kind of grudging awe, the whispers about her past, planted by a bitter stranger, withered and died, starved of the oxygen of belief. In their place grew a new narrative. The tall seamstress was not strange. She was formidable. Calder's recovery was slow but steady. For weeks, he was confined to his cabin, his legs splinted and propped on a pillow. Clara divided her time, spending her mornings in her own room, catching up on the work that had begun to flood in again, and her afternoons at his ranch. She would arrive with a basket containing a hot meal and any mending he needed, and they would sit in the quiet comfort of his cabin, the rhythm of their lives reset by the slow pace of healing. In this enforced stillness, their love deepened, settling into the easy, comfortable shape of a thing meant to last. He watched her hands as she sewed, marveling at the strength and precision in them. She read to him from the Reverend's worn copy of Shakespeare, her low, clear voice filling the small room with kings and queens, lovers and fools. She learned the landscape of his face, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the stubborn set of his jaw when his leg pained him. He learned the nuances of her silences, the difference between a thoughtful quiet and a worried one. They did not need to speak of love. They lived it. In the shared meals, the changed bandages, the quiet companionship that was more profound than any spoken vow. By the time the first real snows of winter returned, blanketing the mountains in a deep, silent shroud of white, Calder was on his feet again. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of his brush with the buckskin Mustang. But he was whole. It was during this time that Jeb, Calder's youngest and most earnest ranch hand, announced his intention to marry a shy, sweet-natured girl from a neighboring homestead. The wedding was to be the first major social event of the winter season, a welcome celebration in the heart of the cold, dark months. It was a given that Calder would be there, and it was a given that Clara would be by his side. For this occasion, Clara decided to make herself a new dress. It was an act not of vanity, but of declaration. She spent her carefully saved coins on a length of silk she ordered from a catalog, a fabric so fine and luxurious it felt like water in her hands. The color was the deep, shadowy green of a pine forest at dusk, a color that made her stormy gray eyes seem almost silver. She designed it herself, the pattern a testament to everything she had learned about fabric and form. It was not a dress made to hide her height, but one designed to celebrate it. The lines were long and clean, the skirt falling in a simple, elegant sweep from her waist to the floor. The sleeves were narrow, the neckline high and modest. But the sheer, quiet elegance of the garment was more breathtaking than any low-cut ball gown. As she took the final stitches, she knew this was more than a dress. It was an answer to every whisper, every stare, every moment of shame she had ever endured. It was the skin of the woman she had become. The wedding was held in the small, candle-lit church. The entire town was packed into the pews, their faces scrubbed and shining, their rough wool clothes smelling of pine soap and wood smoke. When Clara entered, walking beside Calder, a hush fell over the congregation. Every head turned, but this time, the stares were not filled with suspicion or mockery. They were filled with a stunned, open-mouthed admiration. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, her spine as straight and true as the tall pines that grew outside the church walls. The silk dress whispered against the floorboards, its deep green a living, breathing color in the warm candlelight. She was a magnificent sight, a woman of substance and grace, and in that moment, she was not an oddity. She was a queen. She took her place in the front pew beside Calder, a quiet, regal presence. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. The Reverend's voice, warm and familiar, filled the small space. After the young couple had exchanged their vows, the congregation spilled out into the parish hall for the reception. A great feast was laid out on trestle tables, and the fiddler from the harvest social had been persuaded to play. Clara and Calder stood near the great stone fireplace, a cup of warm cider in her hands, watching the dancers. They were a part of the celebration, yet slightly apart, comfortable in their shared solitude. The whispers had not vanished entirely. They had simply changed their tune, but old habits died hard. As a boisterous reel began, two women, cousins of the bride from another town who were not privy to Clara's new standing in Silver Creek, passed behind them. Their voices were low, but in a brief lull in the music, their words carried, sharp and clear. "Look at that one of them whispered, her voice dripping with disdain. "Tall as a man, she must be a full head taller than her intended." Clara heard it. The words were a ghost from her past, a faint echo of an old, familiar pain. She felt an involuntary tightening in her shoulders, the ancient instinct to shrink, to make herself smaller. But before the feeling could take root, she felt Calder's hand, warm and firm, cover her own. He hadn't tensed, he hadn't scowled, he had simply heard, and he was acting. He leaned down, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for her, though his smile was for the whole room to see. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated confidence and amusement. "I'll climb if I have to," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. He squeezed her hand, his eyes twinkling. "But you, Clara May Hollis, you never, ever bow your head." It was everything. It was the story of his parents. It was his promise in the dark of her room. It was his loyalty, his strength, his love, all distilled into a single, perfect sentence. He was not defending her from the whisper. He was arming her against it, reminding her of the truth they had built together, the last vestiges of the old shame, the final ghost of the girl from Kansas, simply dissolved and vanished into the warm, fire-lit air. She looked up at him, and her answering smile was full of a love so profound it needed no words. Later that night, they walked home under a sky full of stars so bright and cold they looked like chips of ice. A fresh layer of snow had fallen, muffling the world in a deep, peaceful silence. The only sound was the soft crunch of their boots. Calder's limp was more pronounced in the cold, and she instinctively slowed her pace to match his. They stopped at the door to her small room, the place where her new life had truly begun. The moonlight on the snow was so bright it was like a second day. They stood in the quiet, their breath pluming in the frigid air, reluctant to let the perfect evening end. Clara looked up at his face, at the strong, kind features she had come to know better than her own. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, of the fear and the loneliness, and of the incredible, unexpected peace she had found. She thought of the promise he had made her on the night of the blizzard, the promise to let her set the pace. She had held that power, that gift, close to her heart, and now, in the safety of his love, she could finally allow herself to test it, to speak her last remaining fear aloud. She leaned in, her voice a soft, playful whisper against the silent, snowy night.
What if I said stop?
Calder looked down at her. His face was serious in the moonlight, but his eyes were filled with a deep, gentle warmth that melted the winter cold. He understood the question. He understood that it was not a rejection, but a final, necessary confirmation. He raised his calloused hand and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I only stop," he answered, his voice a low, solemn vow, "when you want me to." And she smiled, a slow, radiant smile that held all the love, all the certainty, and all the peace in the world. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love to see how far these tales travel. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. For extra support, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.